A big question I always used to ask when I was a new DM is, why would anyone ever want to TPK their party? It just didn't make sense to me. It seemed like a very outrageous idea that was going to make everyone pretty unhappy, but in recent years, I think I've used a TPK 3 total times without ending my game, and honestly, I thought they were really interesting. I found great ways to use them in my story, and so that's what I want to talk about today is how can you use a TPK to enhance your story and have a little bit of fun with something that's kind of unconventional in D&D. Now, the first time I really used this in a way that I thought was super interesting was when one of my players really wasn't feeling the character they wanted to play anymore. They were running a half-orc sorcerer, and they just weren't feeling it. Honestly, they felt like the story arc of the character was kind of done, and they were ready to move on to something else, and I thought of what I think is a really interesting way to kind of go about switching it up. It was also kind of convenient timing because in the next session, they were supposed to fight this horror illithid that they were not ready to handle that was a brain stealer dragon. Now, it was supposed to be a baby brain stealer dragon, and it was supposed to really kind of get them kind of spooked a little bit and starting to show that there were things that were very dangerous lurking in the shadows that they weren't ready to handle. So when I started thinking about this, I decided to take this brain stealer dragon from being a baby to an ancient brain stealer dragon and kind of put them into something that they normally would not be ready to deal with in any way, shape, or form, and make it a truly terrifying encounter. The day of the duel finally came up, and my players, they were starting to come into this mind flare ship, seeing all this magic around, and yet they were somehow able to seemingly walk right through. They weren't finding the ship teeming with mind flares like they were expecting, but rather they were finding a slaughter. Terrified, they continued to creep through all of these narrow hallways, having to squeeze between machinery as it clunked and clittered around, and honestly, they were starting to wonder if there'd be anything for them to fight inside, or if they were just looking for clues as to what happened. As they continued to squeeze through these different entryways, they eventually got into the main cabin where it was nice and big and open, and that's where they found the ancient brain stealer dragon waiting for them. The battle kind of ensued, and slowly, one by one, each and every player fell to the dragon. They all TPK'd. Unfortunately, the entire party fell to this dragon, and nobody made it out. Then, a couple moments later, all of my players think that their characters are dead, and they wake up.
Wake up!
And they're inside this cave, dimly lit with nothing that they can see. And they begin to look around with their heads kind of in this weird state that they were lost, they were confused, they didn't know what was happening. Just a moment ago, they had all died, and now they're waking up and they're starting to talk with each other as they slowly move, still feeling almost stunned from the encounter that they had had, but not where they were before. Roughly reminiscent of the same main room, this cave was wide open, and the crack they had come in through, seemingly just the same, but not pipes anymore, but rather stone and rock. As they began to take tally and kind of communicate their stories, they realized that their half-orc sorcerer was missing. They had no idea what happened to him. He disappeared. So then they traveled all the way up through, squeezing through these reminiscent corridors, and they get to the top. They go back to town, and all of their friends in the town, the merchants who knew them, the barkeep, not remembering the half-orc, confused as to what they were talking about, lost, and they had no idea what was going on. They had always told them that they had a friend who was a human that traveled with them, not some half-orc sorcerer, and these people were confused by what my party was saying. I did it this way because I wanted to show just how powerful the mind flares in the area were, and this brain stealer dragon, which was going to be one of my big bosses. And it continued to be so. But my player actually wanted to use a character that had been captured by the illithids and was kind of serving on their behalf. So what we did was we wrote a story piece where basically he had been taken in by them and swapped out. He was the only person who knew what was going to happen in this session, and even he didn't have the whole picture. But now the party had a quest to find what happened to their lost friend, to try to reunite with him, and not knowing whether or not to trust this other party member that was seemingly put on them. Now, the story did end with them finding their friend, but it was a very long situation. And honestly, it brought a lot of nuance because the new party member had to earn trust with the rest of the party because they didn't know whether he was on the side of the mind flayers or whether he was on their side. They didn't know what was happening, and no one had even heard of the mind flayers before, even though they had been wreaking havoc a few days beforehand. And all my players lost 4 days worth of time in their own minds, and that was enough for the mind flayers to go into hiding and change everyone's memory. It was a really interesting story piece, and I think it's probably my favorite way that I've ever used a TPK. Overall, I think this is one way you can use them, but I honestly think there's an endless ways of using a TPK, especially when people want to change characters. I think it's a great option that allows you to have a lot of creativity. Everybody gets knocked out, and then either some characters die or some are missing. It's a wonderful way to kind of change a story, and that's the narrative that I like to use a TPK for, and I think it's the best situation for it. So I hope you found something useful from this video. If you liked it, check out some of the other ones on this channel, and remember to stay inspired.